All right, so here is the Corsair 2000D airflow case. It looks like it survived the shipping okay. It's basically just protected on the top and the bottom in the box. It's not a real heavy case, but inside the box you get the case obviously all fully assembled, a little safety and compliance information booklet, and the accessories pack, which I believe will probably contain all the screws, extra zip ties, things like that. So let's go ahead and start with the left and the right side panels. Now they both come off identically. And there's just two captive thumb screws for each one. You're going to give it a good firm tug and it's going to come off of there. Now it does have a filter here, but this filter is kind of captive up here in the sides, meaning that you really can't take the filter out. If you ever need to clean the filter material in here, you're just going to take the panel off, wash it as it sits, and then put it back on after it dries. Now the other side panel just comes off in the same fashion. Two captive thumb screws, and pull it off. Although these two panels are very similar to each other, there is a left and a right side panel, and they are marked with a little R and a little L down here in the lower corner. So how these connect back together is there's 4 tabs up front here, and it just engages into these little holes with the other tab here in the front of the chassis. So just engage all of those, put it together, give it a firm push, and then you can put your screws back in. So moving up to the top, you get a top cover, and this just lifts off. It's just 4 magnetic attachments here. Now the front panel is just held on by 4 of these posts, and it's just got a compression fitting in the chassis of the case. So just get a good grip on it and give it a nice firm tug and it will just come right off. There is some filter material here, and again, this isn't really removable. It's meant for you to clean as an entire panel. Working around the back, there is no actual back panel back here, but you do get a removable filter in this case. This is magnetically attached, but it's got a couple metal tabs here kind of holding it in place. You just lift it and you just need to slide it up. So moving over to the right-hand side of the case, we get our fan and AIO cooling bracket. Now this one is removable, but it's 2 screws up here at the top and then it just pivots down, and there's a couple little tabs down in the bottom of the chassis. Just lets go. You can take that out and then go ahead and mount all your cooling hardware. So let's talk real quick about what cooling options you get with this case. Now, starting in the front, you can have up to 320 millimeter fans. There is no support for radiators in the front or support for 140 millimeter fans. So moving over to the side with the included bracket, you can have up to a 360 millimeter radiator here, or a 280, or anything smaller than that will be fine as well. Or you could do 320 millimeter fans, or you could also choose to do 240 millimeter fans. So moving back to the rear of the case, there is support for 2 120 millimeter fans. There is also support for a 240 millimeter radiator in the rear. Now that will be greatly dependent on what GPU you're going to put in here, because the GPU mounts right here very close to the rear panel. So for example, if I put this 1650 RTX in there, it's a 2-slot card, but it really takes up enough space that I can't even use a regular fan. At that point, I'd have to look at using a slim 120 millimeter fan. And if you do anything thicker than this, forget about it. You're not putting anything back there other than what cooling the GPU itself can do. Now, I chose to go with a 360 millimeter radiator. This is the new iCUE Link version of it from Corsair. How I initially was going to do this was I wanted to put the fans on the outside so that we could see some cool RGB on the side over here, but that pushes the radiator closer to the center here. Now, I also chose to put it with the water inlet and outlet at the top, right next to the power supply. But what I found is, although I was able to get that to work and it does fit, it kind of starts pressing on those water hoses and it's a little bit too tight for comfort as far as I'm concerned in there. And so anyways, what I chose to do at that point was just to flip it around to a more traditional setup. I put the fans on the inside with the radiator on the outside, and that's a little bit better because it moves that radiator back, but it still didn't fit exactly as I wanted it to. So how I've kind of ended up with it is I went ahead and I flipped the radiator upside down, meaning the water inlet and outlet hoses are down at the bottom near where the motherboard is, because there's a little bit more room to work with down there. And I've got the fans on the inside and I've got them exhausting air out. Now, one of the problems I had with that initially as well, and I didn't realize this until I was starting to test and kind of look at some of the stats of everything in here, is I noticed that one of the water hoses had interfered with the fan and had stopped it. It wasn't until I looked at the Corsair iCUE stats that I noticed that. So it's a good idea maybe to bring out the old fan grills. Speaking of fan grills, in the user manual for the RGB version of this case, I noticed that the fan grills were already pre-installed for you, so check that out if you're interested. So your maximum GPU length in this case is 320 millimeters, so make sure you check that spec before you purchase this case. If you choose to go air cooling on this, your maximum CPU heatsink height is going to be 90 millimeters. So make sure you just check your hardware against those specifications before you purchase this case if possible, just to make sure it's going to house all of the equipment that you're looking to do. So this gets us into the inside of the case here. We do get our power supply extension cable. We'll talk more about that in just a minute, but that's a way to wrap that down around the back to get power to your power supply. And then we do get all of our front I/O panel cables in here down at the bottom. Front panel I/O is going to be what you would expect on a case like this. We have our power button, obviously, which has an LED built into it, 2 USB 3.2 ports, a USB-C port, headphone jack, and a reset switch. Now the front I/O panel is removable if you need to get to it. And it's just 2 screws, one on each side, and then the whole assembly will come out. Sometimes helpful when you're doing a build to just have this out of the way initially. And now looking back on the left side of the case, this is going to be the rear of the motherboard tray and your power supply bracket here. Now the power supply bracket is removable. There's 2 screws here on the left side of the case. And then there's going to be 2 Phillips head screws at the top here. Then once you get all 4 of those screws removed, you just pivot it down. There's 2 tabs that engage up here in the top, and you can remove that. So the supported power supplies are SFX and SFXL. The documentation is calling for a maximum power supply length of 130 millimeters. So installation is pretty straightforward with the power supply shroud removed. It's just 4 screws that'll hold that in there. And if it's a modular power supply, that'll make it really easy for you to then connect up what cables you need. Now I've chosen to install this power supply with the fan facing the outside of the case. Hopefully that'll just eliminate any contribution of the power supply to the overall heat in the case. Even though it's an air case, we really shouldn't have too much trouble. That's how I'm going to install it. Back of the power supply cage, you get 2 2.5-inch drive mounts. It did only come with 1 drive sled. And it's just a thumb screw here, disengage that, and of course you can position it to the other slot there if you want. In addition to these 2 SSD locations on the power supply cage, there are holes tapped into the top of the case for a 3rd SSD for 3 total. Now, looking on the inside of the case, that's really all that's removable except for the bottom I/O panel. Now, because the motherboard is going to be installed kind of flipped upside down into this, your I/O is going to be down here on the bottom, but you do get a removable panel that will get you access up into this area here. And then obviously your PCI Express slots are right here. And that's pretty much all that's removable. Now this case only supports a mini-itx motherboard, and installation is very straightforward. The standoffs are already pre-installed for you, so it's just get it up there, get your 4 screws installed, and you're ready to continue. So the only thing unique about installing this motherboard is it's going to be in an upside down orientation from what you're used to. Now this particular motherboard doesn't have a built-in I/O shield. It's one of the old-fashioned I/O shields, so it's not going to stick up in there because there's no place in this case to hold the I/O shield in. But that's not a big deal in this particular case. You're not going to see the inside of it, and it's going to be all enclosed anyways. So not a big deal, but a lot of boards will have this already built in. I was not able to put the bottom I/O cover back on. The HDMI cable that I've got coming out of there, and even the USB cables that I've got coming out for this Corsair keyboard, kind of just extend past the bottom. Now I could crunch it up on in there, but there's really no reason to do so. So anyways, it seems like maybe there's not a whole lot of clearance down there. In my case, I couldn't put this back on, but I'm not going to worry about it in this case. So I've got the build in the 2000D case mostly complete, and I'll talk about why in just a second. But overall, my build experience in this is fairly typical of what you would expect in a small form factor case like this. The biggest obstacle being just the very size of the case itself. It's small, it's tight, it's compact, which really just means you might have to get a little bit creative in how you run all your cables and hoses and things like that. So the rest of the build is fairly typical, getting all your front panel I/O, USB, your storage and everything installed. It's just a matter of getting creative and making it serviceable and functional. Because there's no glass or anything, there's really no aesthetic to this case inside, but it is nice when you open up the panel to have everything kind of, tidied up so that if you need to work on it, that it looks good, it's functional, it's out of the way. You know, for example, water hoses interfering with fans. We want to prevent that. The next problem I've had is not with the case itself, but it's with Corsair's iCUE link system. And I just want to touch on this a minute. If you haven't checked out the videos on this system, please go do so. It is really a cool system. It solves the problem that it sets out to solve. It simplifies everything, simplifies cable management, but selection of cables that you get with the products initially really isn't adequate. And some other people have commented, and I've seen it online, where we really need the 90-degree angle cables for this system. For a small form factor like this, it's almost going to be a requirement that you have the 90-degree cables. Now, what I have found, and I've been installing this system in a couple of different cases, messing around with it and playing around with different builds, is I've broke a couple of these cables already. And you know, it's got a little tab on here, and just pulling it out, I think if you put any sideways movement on that, and it's really hard to do when you're trying to pull it out, it's broke the little plastic keeper on the edge of this connector. The standard connector and this case isn't really a good fit. There is not enough room on the top or the bottom to get those standard connections in, and getting a hold of these cables from Corsair is really difficult right now. They're on back order almost every time I check, and they don't even have the cables that have two 90s on there. You know, it's either a standard and a 90. So if you're going to use that system, try to order one or two extra of the cables that have the 90-degree angles on here, because that would have made it much more easy. So currently I'm not able to complete this setup without ripping these fans out of here and replacing them. So prior to me breaking the cable and not being able to complete the build, I was able to do some cooling tests with it, with everything running. And that involved running AF120 and kind of getting everything heated up and letting it run for 30-40 minutes, you know, letting everything kind of max out. And I was getting temperatures in the high 70s, which is really good. This 360 millimeter radiator does a really good job for this CPU. But anyways, once I get it kind of to its hottest point and kind of stabilized at that temperature, I just removed all of the covers. But to me, that's always kind of a good use case as to whether the case is contributing to the heat that's building up in it. And it really made no difference at all. If it did, it was marginal. You have 1 degree, maybe 2 at the most, and it really didn't make a whole lot of difference. Now, that particular test is with the fans running at full tilt, and these QX fans run at 2,500 RPMs. So all 6 of them at 2,500 RPMs, it's a fairly noisy case. So the next testing I did is I turned these all down to 1,000 RPMs and then did the same test. Now the case temperatures were a bit higher, maybe 5-6 degrees higher, you know, in the low 80s, 83, 84 maybe at the most. And then removing the covers at 1,000 degrees, it did lower it a few degrees, not very much. But it was a little more noticeable at that point that there was a little bit buildup. As expected, that seems like a fairly good test to me. But I was going to play around with some slim fans over here in the rear, and I've installed those, but that's when the cables broke. I really don't have a good test bed to continue playing around with it. But overall, this is a very perforated airflow case, so I don't anticipate in most setups that this is going to contribute much positive or negative to your case cooling. Overall, I don't have anything negative to say about this case. In the looks department, I think it looks great. It's a sharp looking little case sitting on your desk. I do personally prefer like the look of the Tower 200 case, even the Tower 100 case. I like that a little bit better. The downside to those and the big upside to this one is you can get a 360 millimeter radiator in here, and that could be a great improvement to your overall cooling. So if you're using hardware that deserves to have a 360 millimeter radiator in here, this really is your choice as opposed to some of those others. So overall, I've got a positive opinion of the 2000D airflow case from Corsair. It's easy to work with. As with any small form factor case like this, you might have to get a little bit creative, but that's all right. That's kind of fun. The bottom I/O is a little bit goofy in here into how the cover maybe doesn't go back on, but no big deal. You'll just have to get creative in how to run the AIO and kind of how your cooling setup's going to go. The back panel back here, it's going to be iffy as to whether you can get any fans back there. And in most cases, if you have a 2-slot GPU, you'll need to use slim fans. With a 3-slot GPU, you're not going to be able to do anything back there unless you want to stick them on the outside or something like that. But overall, if this is a form factor case that you're interested in, you like the looks of it, and you're kind of stuck on it, and your hardware is going to fit in here, it's a good case to work with. So anyways, if you have any questions, comments, concerns about this video, please let me know in the comments below. And if you've built in this case, let me know what your experiences are with it. If you had any problems, specific hardware, things that didn't work very well, please let me know. Anyways, that is going to do it for today. Thanks for watching.